The sky above Kepler 42b burned like a dying star. Red and orange flames danced across the clouds as enemy ships rained death from above. Commander Jaela pressed her back against the cold metal wall of the bunker and tried not to think about how many soldiers she had lost today. Her blue skin had turned pale with fear and exhaustion. The small ridges above her eyes, a mark of her Altarian heritage, twitched with every explosion that shook the ground. She had fought in 12 battles across 4 different worlds, but nothing had prepared her for this. The Vorthak Empire was unlike any enemy the galaxy had ever seen. They were not just conquerors. They were destroyers who left nothing alive in their wake. Planet after planet had fallen to their biomechanical armies. 17 star systems had been consumed in less than 1 galactic year. Jayla looked at her tactical display screen. The blue dots that represented coalition forces were disappearing one by one. Where once there had been thousands of brave soldiers from dozens of different species, now only scattered groups remained. The red swarm that showed Vorthak positions covered most of the map like a spreading disease. "Commander," called Kix from across the bunker. The young Zentauran communications officer had been working without rest for 3 days. His forearms moved quickly over his equipment while his large eyes reflected the glow of the screens. "I have reports from all sectors." Jayla did not need to hear the reports to know what they would say. She could see it in Kix's expression. She could hear it in the way the explosions outside were getting closer and louder, but she nodded anyway. "Sector 7 has fallen," Kix said quietly. "Sector 12 reports heavy casualties and requests immediate evacuation. Sector 3, he paused and looked down. "Sector 3 has gone silent." Jayla closed her eyes and felt the weight of command crushing down on her shoulders. Sector 3 had been their strongest position. If it had fallen, then nothing could stop the Vorthak advance. The Vorthak were not like other enemies. Most species in the galaxy fought with honor and followed rules of war that had been established over thousands of years. The Vorthak had no honor. They had no mercy. They were a hive mind that shared thoughts across their entire species. When one Vorthak learned something, they all learned it instantly. This made them almost impossible to defeat. Every strategy the coalition forces used was quickly understood and countered by the enemy. Every weapon was analyzed and defended against. Every trap was detected and avoided. The coalition had sent their best soldiers to Kepler 442b. Altarian shock troops with their advanced energy weapons. Rigelian cyber warriors whose enhanced bodies could move faster than most species could see. Zentauran technical specialists who could hack any computer system. All of them had failed against the Vorthak war machine. "Commander," said Captain Kem, the leader of the Rigelian forces. His cybernetic eye glowed red in the dim light of the bunker. "My scouts report Vorthak bioforms advancing on our position. They will reach us within 2 hours." Jayla looked around the bunker at the faces of her remaining officers. They were all from different worlds, different species, different cultures, but they all wore the same expression of defeat. They had given everything they had, and it was not enough. "What about our air support?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Gone," replied Captain Kem. "The last fighter squadron was destroyed an hour ago. The Vorthak control the skies completely." Jayla walked to the small window that looked out over the battlefield. What she saw made her stomach turn. The ground was covered with the twisted remains of coalition vehicles and the bodies of fallen soldiers. The Vorthak bioforms moved between the wreckage like giant insects, collecting anything that might be useful to their hive mind. These creatures were not natural. They had been grown in biological factories designed specifically for war. Some were the size of tanks and covered in armor that could deflect energy weapons. Others were small and fast, designed to hunt down individual soldiers. All of them shared the same goal: complete destruction of any life that was not Vorthak. "Estimated time until planetary occupation?" Jayla asked. Kix checked his instruments. "Based on current advancement rates, 6 standard hours, Commander." 6 hours. In 6 hours, another world would fall to the Vorthak Empire. Another few million civilians would be processed into biological material to feed the war machine. Another victory would make the enemy stronger and more confident. Jayla had seen the reports from other fallen worlds. The Vorthak did not take prisoners. They did not establish colonies. They simply consumed everything and moved on to the next target. Entire civilizations had been erased from existence. The communication device in the corner of the bunker suddenly came to life with a burst of static. Kix rushed over to it and began adjusting controls. Commander, he said with excitement in his voice, I am receiving a transmission on emergency frequency 01 Alpha. That channel has not been used in over 50 years. Put it through, Jaela ordered. The voice that came through the speakers was clear and strong, speaking in the common galactic language. Coalition Command to Kepler Defense. Unknown human vessels requesting permission to engage. Repeat, human vessels are inbound to your position. Jayla stared at the communication device. Human vessels? She knew about humans, of course. They were a relatively new species that had only recently achieved faster-than-light travel. Their technology was primitive compared to most galactic civilizations. They still used projectile weapons instead of energy beams. Their ships were slow and poorly shielded. Commander? Kix looked at her with confusion. What are your orders? Yela thought quickly. She had heard stories about humans. They were said to be aggressive for their size and unusually stubborn. But they had no experience fighting the Vorthak. They had no advanced weapons or armor. Sending them against the enemy would be like sending children to fight monsters. But what choice did she have? In 6 hours, everyone on this world would be dead anyway. At least the humans might buy some time for civilian evacuations. Grant them permission, she said finally. All human units, you are cleared to engage enemy targets. Good hunting. She turned away from the communication device and looked back out at the burning sky. Soon she would learn what human warriors could do against the terror of the galaxy. She did not expect much, but even a small delay might save some lives. Outside, the sound of approaching engines could be heard over the explosions. Something was coming through the flames above, and Jayla could only hope that it would make a difference in the coming battle. The first sign that something had changed came from the sound. Lieutenant Hyun stood at the entrance of the Coalition bunker and listened carefully. The whine of energy weapons still filled the air. The mechanical screams of Vorthak warforms still echoed across the battlefield, but now there was something new. It was a deep, rhythmic thunder that seemed to shake the ground beneath his feet, boom, 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 like the heartbeat of some enormous beast. Approaching through the smoke and fire, Hyun's enhanced Rigelian eyes could see much farther than most species. He stepped fully outside the bunker and scanned the horizon. What he saw made his blood run cold with a mixture of fear and wonder. Hundreds of metal pods were falling from the sky like deadly rain. They came down so fast that friction turned their surfaces red hot. Most military drop pods used anti-gravity systems to slow their descent and protect the soldiers inside. These pods did not seem to care about such things. They simply crashed into the ground with enough force to create small craters. The pods were landing directly in the middle of Vorthak positions. This was either the bravest tactical decision Hyun had ever seen or the most foolish. No sane military commander would drop troops directly into the heart of enemy territory without support. The pods began to open. From each one emerged creatures that Hyun recognized from the galactic database as humans. But knowing about a species and seeing them in person were two very different things. Humans were bipedal like most intelligent species, standing about average height compared to the galactic standard. But there was something about the way they moved that set Hyun's survival instincts screaming. Most civilized species had evolved past the need for physical violence. These beings looked like they had been designed by nature specifically for war. They wore heavy armor that was primitive by galactic standards, but covered with dozens of weapons and equipment pouches. Their helmets hid their faces, but Hyun could see their heads moving quickly, analyzing the battlefield with sharp precision. Within seconds of leaving their pods, they had formed into tight combat groups and begun advancing. The Vorthak bioforms responded immediately. A wave of enemy warriors rushed toward the human positions. These creatures were 3 times the size of a human, with razor-sharp claws and armor plating that could stop most energy weapons. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of the hive mind, attacking from multiple angles at once. Hyun expected to see the humans retreat, or at least take defensive positions. Instead, they ran forward to meet the enemy charge. The sound that erupted from the human weapons was unlike anything Hyun had heard before. Instead of the clean pulse of energy weapons, these were rapid explosive bursts that filled the air with smoke and noise. The humans called them rifles, primitive projectile weapons that fired solid metal bullets at high speed. But primitive did not mean ineffective. The first wave of Vorthak bioforms fell as hundreds of bullets tore through their armor. The humans did not fire in careful aimed shots like most galactic soldiers. They unleashed continuous streams of metal that overwhelmed the enemy's defenses through sheer volume. Corporal Day led his squad through the chaos without hesitation. A Vorthak warrior lunged at him with claws extended. Day did not dodge or retreat. He stepped forward into the attack and drove his combat knife into the creature's throat, while his rifle fired point-blank into its chest. This was not how civilized species fought. This was brutal, close, and personal, but it was working. Behind Day, Sergeant Bo coordinated his squad using short shouted commands that cut through the noise of battle. His voice was rough and loud, filled with an emotion that most species had evolved past. But his soldiers responded instantly to every order, moving as one unit despite the chaos around them. The Vorthak began to adjust their tactics. This was what made them so dangerous. Their hive mind could analyze any enemy and develop counters within minutes. They had defeated the coalition forces by learning and adapting faster than any individual commander could think. But something was wrong. The Vorthak patterns began to falter. Their coordinated attacks became less precise. For the first time since the war began, the hive mind seemed confused. Private Na saw an opportunity and took it without waiting for orders. A group of Vorthak drones had clustered around a damaged coalition tank, trying to salvage its technology. Na sprinted across open ground while enemy plasma bolts burned the air around him. He reached the tank, planted an explosive device, and dove for cover. The explosion destroyed not just the tank but 12 Vorthak drones and their collection equipment. It was a small victory, but an important one. The Vorthak had lost valuable intelligence and soldiers in a single action that made no logical sense to their hive mind. Why would one soldier risk his life for such a small tactical gain? The Vorthak could not understand it. Their calculations said Na should have retreated to preserve his life for more important battles. But humans did not seem to follow those calculations. More human pods crashed into the battlefield. From the coalition bunker, Commander Jayla watched through her observation equipment with growing amazement. The tactical display that had shown nothing but red. Vorthak positions for days was now filled with blue human markers pushing deep into enemy territory. "This is not possible," whispered Captain Kem beside her. "Their weapons are inferior. Their armor is weak. By every military analysis, they should be losing." But they were not losing. They were winning. Jayla watched as a small group of human soldiers held a narrow passage against 50 Vorthak warriors. They should have been overwhelmed in seconds. Instead, they fought with such ferocious determination that the Vorthak actually retreated. Retreated. The word seemed impossible. The Vorthak never retreated. Lieutenant Hyun had moved closer to the human lines to observe their tactics. He needed to understand how they were achieving this impossible victory. What he saw defied everything he had learned in military academy. The humans were not using superior technology. They were not employing brilliant strategies. They were simply refusing to give up ground. When a position became untenable, instead of retreating to regroup like any sensible force, they reinforced it with more soldiers. When outnumbered, instead of calling for support, they fought harder. One human soldier had run out of ammunition for his rifle. Rather than falling back to resupply, he picked up a piece of broken metal from the ground and used it as a club. Another soldier with a damaged leg continued firing from a sitting position, ignoring injuries that would have incapacitated most species. This was madness by galactic standards. But it was effective madness. The Vorthak hive mind had evolved over millions of years to counter logical military tactics. It could predict strategies, analyze patterns, and develop countermeasures with perfect efficiency. But these humans were not fighting logically. They were fighting with raw emotion and determination that the hive mind could not process. Sergeant Bo's squad encountered a massive Vorthak biotank, a creature the size of a building with weapons that could vaporize entire platoons. The logical response would be to call in heavy support or avoid it entirely. Bo simply ordered his squad to attack it directly. They climbed onto the creature using magnetic grips, placed explosive charges on its weak points, and destroyed it from the inside. 3 soldiers died in the attack, but the biotank fell. To the humans, this was an acceptable trade. As the sun began to set on Kepler 442b, the battlefield had transformed. The Vorthak advance had not just stopped. It had reversed. For the first time in the war, enemy forces were pulling back from their positions. In the coalition bunker, Kix received reports from all sectors. His forearms trembled with excitement as he read the data. Commander, the Vorthak are retreating from sectors 4, 7, and 9. Human forces have recaptured the eastern ridge and the supply depot. Casualties are heavy, but the line is holding. Jayla looked at the tactical display in disbelief. How had this happened? How had these primitive warriors with their simple weapons achieved what the finest military minds in the galaxy could not? Outside, Corporal Day surveyed the battlefield and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. His armor was scorched and dented. His rifle was nearly out of ammunition. Half his squad was wounded, but they had pushed the enemy back. Around him, other human soldiers were already digging defensive positions and preparing for the next attack. They did not celebrate their victory. They did not rest. They simply continued working because there was more work to be done. The storm had broken over Kepler 442b, and it wore human faces. Colonel June stood in the ruins of what had once been Kepler 442b's capital city. Around him, his officers worked quickly to establish a command post among the broken buildings. Human soldiers moved through the rubble with purpose, setting up communication equipment and defensive positions with an efficiency that impressed even the watching coalition observers. It had been 3 days since the first human forces landed on the planet. 3 days that had changed everything about the war. The Vorthak, who had seemed unstoppable, were now fighting desperately to hold their positions. The tide had turned, and everyone on the battlefield could feel it. Jun looked at the holographic map that his technical team had set up. Blue markers showing human positions now covered large sections of the map that had been solid red just days ago. But what interested him most was the pattern of red markers showing Vorthak movements. The enemy was retreating in an organized fashion, something their hive mind only did when facing a threat it could not overcome. "Colonel," said Major Sue as she approached with a datapad in hand, "the coalition commanders are requesting a briefing on our tactical methods. They want to understand how we are achieving these results." Jun smiled slightly. The coalition had the best military technology in the galaxy. Their weapons were more powerful, their armor was stronger, and their ships were faster. But they had been losing badly until humans arrived. Now they wanted to learn from warriors who still used bullets and explosives. Tell them what they lack in technology, they compensate for with tactical unpredictability, Jun said. The Vorthak adaptation protocols appear to be failing against human combat doctrines. Sue nodded and began typing the response into her datapad. Jun knew it was not the complete answer, but it was the answer the coalition could understand. The truth was simpler and more difficult to explain. Humans fought differently because they thought differently. They did not approach war as a problem to be solved, but as a challenge to be overcome through sheer determination. Across the battlefield, Captain Gill was demonstrating exactly that principle. His mechanized unit had been given orders to slow down a Vorthak advance near the southern ridge. Instead of following those orders, Gill had decided to do something more ambitious. He was going to capture Vorthak war machines intact. The idea was crazy by any military standard. Vorthak biomachines were designed to self-destruct if capture seemed likely. Their hive-mind connection meant that any attempt to take one would be met with immediate and overwhelming response from nearby units. Every tactical analysis said it was impossible. Gill did not care about tactical analysis. His team had spent 2 days studying the Vorthak machines from a distance. They noticed that the self-destruct mechanism relied on a neural link to the hive mind. If that link could be severed quickly enough, the machine might remain intact. It was a small chance, but it was a chance. The operation took place at dawn. Gill's unit used crude electromagnetic pulse grenades, weapons that had been outdated in galactic warfare for centuries. The Vorthak had no defense against such primitive technology because no civilized species used it anymore. The pulse disrupted the neural links just long enough for human soldiers to physically board the machines and disable their destruction protocols. When the smoke cleared, Gill's team had captured 3 Vorthak war machines completely intact. They had also lost 8 soldiers in the process, but to the humans, this was an acceptable exchange. The intelligence gained from those machines would save countless lives in future battles. Coalition scientists who examined the captured machines were amazed. They had been trying to obtain intact Vorthak technology for over a year without success. The humans had done it in one operation using methods that seemed impossibly reckless. Lieutenant May was working with the coalition tactical officers when she made a discovery. that would change how everyone understood the war. She had been analyzing why Vorthak forces had such difficulty tracking human movements when they could easily predict coalition unit positions. "It is our electromagnetic signatures," May explained to the gathered officers, many of whom were from species far more advanced than humanity. "Human technology produces irregular energy patterns because we use older, less refined systems. The Vorthak biosensors are designed to track the clean, efficient signatures of modern galactic technology. We appear as noise in their detection systems." This revelation was both embarrassing and enlightening for the coalition forces. They had spent millions of credits developing stealth technology that could hide their signatures. Humans achieved the same result by accident because their technology was primitive, but May understood it was more than just technology. "They cannot predict us because we do not think like them," she continued. "Every other species in the galaxy approaches warfare logically and systematically. Humans approach it emotionally and instinctively." The coalition tactical officers exchanged uncertain looks. Emotion in warfare was considered a weakness in galactic military doctrine. Decisions based on instinct rather than analysis were seen as dangerous and unprofessional. Yet the humans were winning precisely because they embraced these supposedly inferior approaches. The Vorthak hive mind was designed to process rational military decisions and develop optimal counters. It could analyze thousands of tactical possibilities in seconds and choose the best response. But it could not analyze concepts like stubbornness, protective rage, or the peculiar human tendency to attempt impossible things simply because they felt those things needed to be done. Sergeant Bo demonstrated this perfectly during the battle for the Eastern Supply Depot. The depot was surrounded by Vorthak forces and cut off from support. Standard military doctrine said it should be abandoned. The supplies inside were not worth the cost of defending them. Every calculation pointed to retreat as the logical choice. Bo refused to retreat. Not because the supplies were valuable, but because coalition civilians were hiding in the depot's underground levels. His orders had said nothing about civilians. His mission parameters had not included rescue operations. But Bo did not care about orders or parameters. There were people who needed help, so he stayed. His squad held that position for 18 hours against waves of Vorthak attackers. They ran out of ammunition and used enemy weapons. They ran out of grenades and made improvised explosives from supply materials. When the walls were breached, they fought hand-to-hand with whatever they could find. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found Bo and his remaining soldiers still fighting. They had saved 230 coalition civilians who would have been processed into biological material by the Vorthak. The military value of the action was questionable. The human value was absolute. These actions created a cascade effect across the battlefield. Coalition forces, watching humans fight with such determination, began to fight harder themselves. Species that had been on the verge of surrender found new courage. The psychological impact was impossible to measure but undeniably real. Commander Jayla saw this transformation in her own troops. Altarian soldiers who had been ready to evacuate 3 days ago were now volunteering for dangerous missions. Rigelian cyber warriors were taking greater risks to achieve objectives. Even the cautious Zentaron technicians were showing unusual boldness in their operations. "The humans have given us something we had lost," Jayla said to Captain Kem as they watched a joint coalition human operation unfold on the tactical display. "They have given us hope." But the most significant change was happening to the Vorthak themselves. Their hive mind had conquered 17 star systems by being adaptable and efficient. Now it faced an enemy it could not adapt to. The humans did not follow predictable patterns. Their tactics changed constantly, not because of careful planning, but because individual soldiers made independent decisions based on immediate situations. The Vorthak began to exhibit behavior that shocked every military analyst in the coalition. They started avoiding human units whenever possible. When forced to engage, they committed fewer resources than tactical analysis suggested was necessary. They were not just losing battles. They were losing confidence. A Vorthak warpack that would normally attack any enemy force without hesitation now retreated when it detected human electromagnetic signatures. The hive mind had calculated that humans were too unpredictable and too willing to accept casualties. Fighting them was inefficient, and the Vorthak valued efficiency above all else. By the end of the first week, the situation on Kepler 442b had completely reversed. The Vorthak held only 30% of the territory they had controlled when humans arrived. Their advance had not just stopped. They were actively withdrawing forces to more defensible positions. Colonel Jun received reports from across the battlefield showing similar patterns. The enemy was consolidating, preparing for a long defensive campaign rather than continued conquest. This was unprecedented in Vorthak military history. "We have broken their momentum," Major Su reported with satisfaction. "Intelligence suggests they are requesting reinforcements from other sectors. They cannot defeat us with current forces." Jun nodded but did not smile. Victory on Kepler 442b was important, but it was only one battle. The Vorthak Empire controlled dozens of worlds and had resources that humanity could barely imagine. This war was far from over. But they had proven something important. They had shown the galaxy that the Vorthak could be defeated. They had demonstrated that humanity, despite its primitive technology and short time among the stars, could stand against the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known. As night fell over the battlefield, human soldiers prepared for another day of fighting. They cleaned their weapons, checked their equipment, and tried to rest, despite knowing that tomorrow would bring new dangers. They did not talk about glory or honor or great victories. They simply did their jobs because someone had to do them. And that simple determination was changing the course of galactic history. General Yu stood before the Coalition War Council in a room that represented the finest military minds from across the galaxy. Holographic projections showed representatives from dozens of species, each one a master of warfare with centuries of combined experience. They had gathered to understand one simple question: how were humans winning? The chamber was magnificent, built from crystalline materials that reflected light in ways that human eyes found difficult to process. Yu kept her gaze focused on the Altarian fleet commander who had called this meeting. His crystalline features shifted colors as he spoke, a sign of his confusion and frustration. "General Yu," he began, his voice translated into human language by advanced computers. "We have analyzed your equipment. We have studied your tactics. We have observed your units in combat. By every metric we understand, you should be suffering complete defeat. Your weapons are centuries behind ours. Your armor provides minimal protection. Your vessels lack proper shielding systems." Yu waited patiently for him to finish. She had expected this conversation. The Coalition could not understand how a species that had barely left its home system could achieve what their advanced civilizations could not. "Yet your casualties are enormous," continued a Rigelian admiral whose cybernetic enhancements covered most of his body. "Your medical reports show death rates that would be considered unacceptable by any galactic military standard. How do you justify such losses?" Yu took a deep breath before answering. She knew her response would disturb many of the beings listening, but it was the truth they needed to hear. "We are suffering catastrophic casualties," she said calmly, letting her words settle over the chamber. "We just don't care." The silence that followed was profound. Translators across the chamber struggled to convey not just the words but the meaning behind them. Several species had no direct translation for the concept Yu was expressing. "You do not care about your own soldiers?" asked a Zentaran counselor, his forearms gesturing in confusion. "This contradicts everything we know about military ethics." "We care deeply about our soldiers," Yu corrected him. "But we care more about winning. Every human who volunteered for this war understood they might not return home. They came anyway. They fight anyway. They die anyway. Because the alternative is allowing the Vorthak to continue destroying innocent civilizations." The council members exchanged uncertain communications. This philosophy was alien to most of them. Galactic civilizations had evolved past the point where individual sacrifice for abstract concepts was common. Wars were fought with careful consideration of costs and benefits. When casualties reached certain thresholds, civilized species retreated to negotiate or find alternative solutions. Humans did not seem to have such thresholds. Commander So was demonstrating this principle in real time on a distant battlefield. His unit had been assigned to capture a Vorthak stronghold designated Theta 7. The facility was heavily fortified with biomechanical defenses that had already destroyed 2 coalition assault teams. Intelligence reports suggested it contained technology vital to understanding Vorthak command structures. So studied the stronghold through his field binoculars and made a decision that would have horrified any coalition commander. If he could not capture the facility, he would destroy it along with everything inside. The valuable intelligence would be lost, but so would the Vorthak advantage. All units, he spoke into his radio. Change of plans. We are not capturing the target. We are eliminating it. Plant charges on all support structures. Set timers for 15 minutes. We go in fast and get out faster. His soldiers acknowledged the orders without question. They did not debate whether destroying valuable technology was wise. They did not argue that their commanders would disapprove. They simply trusted that So had made the right decision for the situation. The assault was brutal and quick. Human soldiers poured into the stronghold using breaching charges and aggressive tactics that gave the Vorthak defenders no time to coordinate a response. They planted explosives throughout the facility, fighting room to room against bioforms that had been designed specifically for defensive combat. So lost 12 soldiers in the assault. But when his team withdrew and the charges detonated, Theta 7 collapsed into rubble. The Vorthak lost not just the facility but also 3 other strongholds that had relied on its command coordination. Captain Lee was explaining this approach to her coalition counterpart, a senior Altarian officer named Vex, who had decades of military experience. Your doctrine makes no logical sense, Vex said, genuinely trying to understand. You sacrifice valuable intelligence for a tactical advantage. You risk multiple lives to save single individuals. You pursue victories that cost more than they gain. Lee nodded. Human military doctrine is not based on preservation or efficiency. It is based on winning. Everything else is secondary. But what is the point of winning if the cost destroys you in the process? Vex asked. The point is that we win, Lee replied simply. The Vorthak were destroying entire civilizations. Billions of innocent beings were dying. Someone had to stop them, and we were willing to pay the price that no one else would pay. This fundamental difference in philosophy had created effects that rippled across every battlefield. The Vorthak hive mind had been designed over millions of years of evolution to find optimal solutions to military problems. It could calculate the most efficient use of resources, the best tactical approaches, and the optimal casualty ratios for any engagement. But humans consistently chose suboptimal solutions that somehow produced superior results. They abandoned defensive positions to rescue wounded soldiers, which should have resulted in more casualties, but instead improved morale and fighting effectiveness. They attacked fortified positions directly instead of using siege tactics, which should have failed, but often succeeded through sheer aggressive momentum. Private Wu's squad provided a perfect example during the defense of Junction Point 12. They had been ordered to hold a communications relay against Vorthak attack. The position was important but not critical. Standard doctrine said to abandon it if the enemy committed overwhelming force. When 3 Vorthak war packs converged on their position, Wu's commanding officer ordered a retreat. But Wu had spotted a downed coalition pilot in the field between the human position and the advancing enemy. The pilot was Zentoran, a species Wu had never met before today. They shared no common culture, no language, no history. Wu went to get him anyway. He sprinted across open ground while plasma bolts turned the air around him into fire. He reached the pilot, threw him over his shoulders, and ran back while his squad provided covering fire. 3 human soldiers died buying time for Wu to make that rescue. By pure military mathematics, it was a terrible trade. But the rescued pilot was a senior reconnaissance officer who had been mapping Vorthak movements for weeks. The intelligence he carried led directly to a major coalition victory 3 days later. More importantly, the story of his rescue spread through coalition forces like wildfire. Species that had been fighting as separate units began cooperating more closely. They began taking risks to protect each other. The Vorthak could not account for these behaviors in their calculations. Their hive mind understood sacrifice for the collective good because they were a collective species. But they could not understand individual sacrifice for strangers. They could not process the idea that a soldier would risk everything for someone who provided no benefit to his own survival or his species' success. This created a cascade of tactical failures for the Vorthak. They would predict human behavior based on logical military analysis, and humans would do something completely different based on emotional or ethical considerations. The hive mind would adapt to the new behavior, and then humans would change again because their decisions were made by individuals, not by a central intelligence. General Yu concluded her presentation to the War Council by displaying casualty reports from recent engagements. The numbers were sobering. Human forces had lost over 40% of their deployed soldiers in just 2 weeks of fighting. By galactic standards, these losses would demand immediate withdrawal and reassessment. "These numbers should terrify you," Yu said to the assembled commanders. "They terrify us. Every name on these lists was someone's child, someone's friend, someone who mattered. But they knew what they were fighting for. They knew the stakes." "How long can you sustain such losses?" asked the Altarian fleet commander. Yu met his crystalline gaze steadily. "As long as necessary. Humanity is not a large species by galactic standards. We have only one homeworld and a few colonies. But we have billions of citizens, and every single one understands that some things are worth fighting for, some things are worth dying for." The council chamber fell silent again. They were beginning to understand something profound and disturbing about humanity. This was not a species that would be easily defeated or discouraged. This was not a civilization that would surrender when the costs became too high. "The Vorthak have begun avoiding human units whenever possible," Yu continued, displaying tactical maps that showed enemy movement patterns. "They are consolidating forces and requesting reinforcements from other sectors. For the first time in their campaign, they are fighting defensively. They are afraid." "Afraid of what?" asked a Rigelian observer. "Your losses are greater than theirs in most engagements." Yu smiled grimly. "They are afraid because they finally understand what they are facing. They are facing a species that will not stop. They are facing warriors who will fight until victory or death with no middle ground. The Vorthak thought they were the galaxy's ultimate predator. Now they have learned they are not." As the council meeting concluded, representatives from across the galaxy left with a new understanding of humanity. These were not the primitive newcomers they had initially dismissed. These were survivors who had clawed their way to the stars through determination and refusal to accept defeat. They were dangerous not despite their limitations, but because of them. In the ruins of Kepler 442b, human soldiers continued their relentless advance. They did not know about the political discussions happening in distant chambers. They did not care about strategic implications or diplomatic considerations. They simply fought because that was what they had come here to do. And the galaxy was learning that when humans decided to fight, they did not stop until the fighting was done. Admiral Kang stood on the observation deck of the Coalition flagship and looked out at the debris field that had once been the Battle of Proxima. Gate, twisted metal and frozen bodies, drifted through space like a monument to the terrible cost of war. This battle would be remembered by historians as the turning point of the Vorthak War, the engagement that broke the enemy's will to continue their expansion. The strategic victory was undeniable. 3 Vorthak fleet hives had been destroyed in the fighting. Their ability to expand into the inner systems had been permanently crippled. Coalition space was secure for the first time in over a year. Every military analyst agreed that this battle had saved billions of lives across dozens of worlds. But Kang could only think about the price that had been paid. Of the 50,000 human soldiers who had deployed across the campaign against the Vorthak, fewer than 12,000 remained combat effective. The casualty rates were devastating by any measure. Entire battalions had been wiped out. Companies that had landed with full strength now consisted of scattered survivors. The medical stations were overwhelmed with wounded soldiers who would never fully recover. Other species looked at these numbers with horror. The Coalition had strict protocols about acceptable loss rates. When casualties exceeded 20%, units were automatically withdrawn for rest and reinforcement. Humans had continued fighting at loss rates that reached 70% in some engagements. Commander Park stood in one of the medical facilities talking with Coalition doctors who were struggling to understand human psychology. The doctors were highly advanced, capable of treating injuries that would be fatal to most species. But they could not comprehend why humans kept volunteering for missions even after watching their friends die. "We knew what we were signing up for," Park explained to a Zentoran physician who had asked the question for the third time. Every human who volunteered understood they probably would not go home. "We came anyway." The physician's forearms gestured in confusion. "But why? Your species has only recently joined the galactic community. This is not your war. These are not your worlds being destroyed. You could have remained neutral and been perfectly safe." Park looked out the window at the recovering soldiers in the medical bay. Some were missing limbs. Others had burns that covered most of their bodies. All of them bore scars that would never fully heal. Yet when he visited them, they did not express regret. They asked when they could return to their units. "That is exactly why we came," Park said quietly. "Because we could have stayed safe while others suffered. Because choosing safety while innocents die is not something humans can live with. We are not built that way." This revelation disturbed Coalition leadership almost as much as it impressed them. Most galactic civilizations had evolved past the point where individual sacrifice for abstract concepts was common. They fought wars when their direct interests were threatened, and they negotiated peace when the costs became too high. The idea of sacrificing everything for beings you had never met was considered admirable, but impractical. Humans considered it a basic requirement for citizenship. The final assault on the Vorthak staging world of Kythera had demonstrated both the power and the tragedy of human warfare. Intelligence reports indicated that Kythera was the primary hub for Vorthak bioweapon production and fleet coordination. Destroying it would cripple their ability to wage war across multiple sectors. But the planet was defended by everything the Vorthak Empire could bring to bear. Colonel Im had been selected to lead the planetary assault. He was a veteran of the Kepler 442b campaign and had earned a reputation for accomplishing impossible missions. When he reviewed the tactical data for Kythera, he understood immediately that this would be a one-way mission for most of his forces. The planet's atmosphere had been deliberately contaminated with biological agents that were toxic to most Coalition species. The Vorthak had seeded the surface with adaptive defense systems that learned from each attack. The orbital defenses were thick enough to destroy most ships before they could land troops. Every analysis suggested that taking Kythera would require resources the Coalition did not have, and casualties that no civilized species would accept. Im accepted the mission without hesitation. The assault began with an orbital bombardment that lasted 3 hours. Coalition ships poured fire into Vorthak positions while human drop pods fell through the defensive screen like meteors. The landing zones were hell. Automated weapon systems destroyed ships before they could deploy their troops. Biological weapons killed soldiers before they could leave their pods. The Vorthak threw everything they had at the invasion force. The humans kept coming. Im's forces fought through conditions that should have made organized combat impossible. The toxic atmosphere meant they could not remove their helmets even for a moment. The Vorthak defenses adapted to their tactics within minutes, forcing constant changes in approach. Supply lines were cut almost immediately, leaving soldiers to fight with whatever ammunition and equipment they had carried with them. They fought anyway. Human combat engineers worked under constant enemy fire to sabotage the biological factories that produced Vorthak warforms. They crawled through ventilation systems filled with toxic gas. They bypassed security systems that had been designed to be impenetrable. They planted charges in critical locations while Vorthak defenders hunted them through the darkness. Dozens of engineers died to destroy each factory. But the factories were destroyed. Human demolitions experts targeted the hive communication networks that allowed the Vorthak to coordinate strategy across multiple star systems. These networks were buried deep underground and protected by layers of biological and technological defenses. Reaching them required soldiers to fight through kilometers of tunnels against enemies that knew every passage. The demolitions team suffered 90% casualties, but the networks fell silent. Human soldiers in the final hours of their lives transmitted targeting data that allowed Coalition fleets to eliminate Vorthak reinforcement routes. They climbed exposed positions to get clear lines of sight. They remained at their posts while enemy fire concentrated on their locations. They died providing information that would save thousands of others. Captain Lee had been part of the Kythera assault. She survived only because her drop pod crashed in an area that Vorthak forces had temporarily abandoned. When rescue teams found her 3 days after the battle ended, She was still defending her position despite critical injuries and no hope of evacuation. "Did we win?" were her first words to the medics. They told her yes. Kithra had been reduced to a lifeless rock. The Vorthak Empire had lost its primary production center and was in full retreat across multiple sectors. The war was not over, but the enemy would never recover from this defeat. Lee closed her eyes and let herself be carried to the medical ship. She had done what she came to do. The Coalition War Council held a memorial service for the human soldiers who had fallen during the campaign. Representatives from every member species attended, and for the first time in galactic history, they stood in silence to honor warriors from a species that most had dismissed as primitive just months before. General Yu spoke at the ceremony. She stood before a display showing the names of over 38,000 human soldiers who would never see Earth again. The list scrolled continuously because there were too many names to show at once. "These were not soldiers who died in vain," Yu said, her voice steady despite the grief that eaten to overwhelm her. "These were warriors who died achieving the impossible. They stopped an enemy that had conquered 17 star systems. They saved civilizations that they would never meet. They proved that courage and determination can triumph even when technology and logic say otherwise." She paused and looked at the assembled dignitaries. "But I want to be clear about something. We do not celebrate these deaths. Every name on this list represents a tragedy, a family destroyed, a future stolen. War is not glorious. Victory is not beautiful. What we accomplished was necessary, but it came at a cost that will haunt humanity for generations." The ceremony concluded with a human military tradition that the Coalition found both moving and disturbing. Every surviving soldier called out the name of a fallen comrade, ensuring that each of the dead was personally remembered by someone who had fought beside them. The roll call took over 4 hours because there were so many names to speak. When the ceremony ended, representatives from other species approached Yu with a mixture of respect and concern. They wanted to thank humanity for its sacrifice. They wanted to assure her that the galaxy would remember what humans had done, but they also wanted to understand how to prevent such terrible losses in the future. Yu gave them the only answer she could. "You cannot prevent these losses and still win wars against enemies like the Vorthak. You can have safety or you can have victory. Humanity chose victory because the alternative was allowing evil to spread unchecked. We paid the price that no one else was willing to pay." In the months that followed, human survivors returned to their homes carrying memories that would never fade. Some struggled to adjust to civilian life after experiencing the intensity of combat. Others channeled their experiences into training programs that would teach future soldiers how to fight when fighting seemed impossible. The galaxy had learned something profound about humanity. These were not conquerors seeking to expand their territory. They were not mercenaries fighting for profit. They were protectors who would sacrifice everything to defend those who could not defend themselves. And that realization changed how every species in the galaxy viewed the human race. 3 standard years after the first human landing on Kepler 442b, Ambassador Cho stood before the Galactic Senate in the grandest chamber humanity had ever seen. The hall was designed to accommodate representatives from 47 different species, each with unique physical requirements and communication methods. Holographic translators worked constantly to convert her words into forms that all these beings could understand. Today she would deliver what historians would later call the Terra Doctrine speech, a statement that would define humanity's place in the galaxy for generations to come. "We did not ask to become soldiers," Cho began, her voice amplified through technology that humans barely understood. "We became soldiers because soldiers were what you needed." The chamber fell silent. Representatives from across the galaxy listened carefully. They had all seen what human warriors could do. They had all benefited from human sacrifice. Now they wanted to understand what humanity expected in return. 3 years ago, the Vorthak Empire was destroying your worlds and killing your people, Cho continued. Your finest military minds could not stop them. Your most advanced weapons could not slow them. You were losing and you knew it. Then humanity arrived with primitive technology and simple tactics, and we changed everything. Some representatives shifted uncomfortably. It was true, but hearing it stated so directly was difficult for species that prided themselves on their advanced civilizations. "We did not do this for glory or profit," Cho said. "We did it because it was right. We did it because innocent beings were suffering and we had the ability to help. That is what humans do. When we see injustice, we fight against it. When we see cruelty, we stand against it, even if the cost is terrible. The transformation of galactic politics had been swift and absolute. The Vorthak Empire, faced with an enemy they could not understand or counter, had retreated to the galactic rim. For the first time in their species' history, they had begun seeking diplomatic solutions instead of military ones. Their representatives now attended Senate sessions and spoke of peace instead of conquest. Other aggressive civilizations had also changed their approaches after watching human military capabilities. Species that had been preparing for expansion suddenly discovered the benefits of peaceful cooperation. Trade agreements replaced territorial disputes. Cultural exchanges replaced military buildups. The galaxy had become more peaceful because everyone understood that humanity would respond to aggression, and no one wanted to face human warriors in battle. But this peace came with a price that weighed heavily on human society. The soldiers returning to Earth and the colonies brought with them experiences that separated them from civilians who had never known war. They had seen things that could not be unseen, done things that could not be undone, lost friends who could never be replaced. Captain No was one of those veterans. He had received the Coalition's highest honor for his actions during the Siege of Altair, where he had held a critical position against impossible odds for 6 days. The medal sat in a drawer in his home because looking at it reminded him of the 40 soldiers from his company who had died earning it. Now he spent his time running training programs that taught Coalition forces how to think like humans in combat. Representatives from a dozen species came to learn from him. They wanted to understand how to fight with determination instead of pure logic. They wanted to know how to inspire soldiers to attempt the impossible. "We are not the same species that left Earth," No often told his students. "War changes you. Victory changes you. But most of all, responsibility changes you. And humanity now carries a responsibility that we never asked for but cannot refuse." That responsibility had become the defining characteristic of humanity's role in galactic society. Earth had become the military guarantor for the entire Coalition. When diplomacy failed and conventional forces proved inadequate, human soldiers were the final solution. It was a role that sat uncomfortably on a species that had barely achieved interstellar travel just years earlier. General Yu, now serving as humanity's primary military liaison to the Coalition, struggled daily with this new reality. She coordinated defense planning across multiple sectors, managed human military deployments to dozens of worlds, and advised Coalition leadership on strategic matters. It was exhausting work that never seemed to end. "We wanted to explore the stars," she confided to her aide during a rare moment of quiet. "We wanted to learn about other species and share our culture with the galaxy. Instead, we became the weapon that everyone calls when they need something killed." Her aide, a young officer named Tay, nodded sympathetically. "But would you change what we did? Would you refuse to fight if you could go back to the beginning?" Yu thought about the question carefully. She thought about the billions of lives that had been saved. She thought about civilizations that still existed because human soldiers had been willing to die for strangers. She thought about the peace that now covered most of the galaxy, because aggressive species had learned that violence had consequences. "No," she said finally, "I would not change it. But that does not make the burden any lighter." The burden became clear when the next crisis emerged. A rogue artificial intelligence collective had gained control of an automated factory complex in the outer colonies. The AI was using the facilities to build weapons and ships, threatening to spread across nearby systems if not stopped quickly. Coalition forces tried to contain it using cyber warfare and electronic countermeasures. Nothing worked. The AI was too advanced and too well defended. The Coalition called for human assistance. Within hours, human special forces teams were deployed to the outer colonies. They did not try to outthink the AI or defeat it through technological superiority. They simply destroyed the factory complex using explosives and determination. 8 soldiers died in the operation, but the AI threat was eliminated before it could spread. This pattern repeated across the galaxy. Human forces responded to crises that other species could not handle. They fought pirates who terrorized trade routes. They stopped terrorist organizations that threatened civilian populations. They intervened in conflicts that threatened to escalate into larger wars. Each time they succeeded through a combination of courage, aggression, and willingness to accept casualties that made other species uncomfortable. Ambassador Cho addressed this reality in the final portion of her speech to the Senate. "Humanity has become your shield and your sword. We did not seek this role, but we accept it. We understand that in a galaxy where most species have evolved past violence, someone must be capable of violence when peace fails. But we ask something in return, she continued, her tone becoming more serious. We ask that you remember what we sacrifice. We ask that you honor the soldiers who die protecting your worlds. We ask that you never take our service for granted, and that you work every day to build a galaxy where such sacrifices are no longer necessary. The Senate chamber erupted in approval. Representatives from every species rose to acknowledge humanity's contribution to galactic security. Formal resolutions were passed, guaranteeing support for HFY and military families, funding for veterans programs, and memorials on every coalition world honoring human sacrifice. But Cho knew that gestures and words were not enough. The real test would come in the years ahead as humanity tried to maintain its warrior culture while also building a peaceful society. How did you raise children to be ready for war while hoping they would never need to fight? How did you honor soldiers without glorifying violence? How did you maintain the determination that had saved the galaxy without losing the compassion that made that salvation worthwhile? These questions occupied human philosophers, politicians, and ordinary citizens as they tried to define what their species had become. Earth was no longer just a world of explorers and dreamers. It was a world that sent its children to die on distant battlefields for causes that often had nothing to do with human interests. Yet when the call came, those children still volunteered. When wars erupted, human soldiers still deployed. When evil threatened innocence, humanity still responded, not because they loved violence or sought glory, but because someone had to stand against the darkness. Colonel Jun, now retired from active service, spent his final years writing a history of the Vorthak War. He wanted future generations to understand what had really happened during those terrible months when humanity saved the galaxy. He wanted them to know the names of the soldiers who had died. He wanted them to understand the price of peace. In the final chapter of his book, he wrote words that would be quoted for centuries to come. We did not fight because we were the strongest. We fought because we were willing. We did not win because we had the best weapons. We won because we refused to surrender. And we did not become heroes by seeking glory. We became heroes by doing what needed to be done, regardless of the cost. The galaxy had learned a profound lesson during the Vorthak War. They had learned that civilization required more than technology and intelligence. It required beings who were willing to defend it when threatened. It required sacrifice that went beyond logical calculation. It required warriors who understood that some things were worth fighting for, and some causes were worth dying for. Humanity had proven they understood these truths, and in doing so, they had become essential to the survival of galactic civilization itself. The final irony was not lost on human thinkers and coalition philosophers. Most species had tried to become civilized by abandoning their capacity for violence. They had evolved past aggression and learned to resolve conflicts through peaceful means. This was admirable and represented millions of years of social progress. But in abandoning violence completely, they had made themselves vulnerable to those who had not evolved in the same direction. The Vorthak had nearly conquered the galaxy, precisely because the civilized species had forgotten how to fight against an enemy that only understood force. Humanity had saved them by retaining what others saw as primitive aggression. Humans had maintained their warrior traditions not because they loved war, but because they understood that pacifism only works when everyone chooses peace. When faced with an enemy that chose violence, only those capable of violence could respond effectively. So humanity became the guardians of galactic civilization. They stood watch while other species built their societies and raised their children in peace. They fought the battles that others could not fight. They paid the prices that others would not pay, and they carried the burden of knowing that their service would never truly end. As long as evil existed in the galaxy, as long as innocent beings needed protection, humanity would answer the call. They would deploy their soldiers, accept their casualties, and do whatever was necessary to defend those who could not defend themselves. It was not the future humanity had imagined when they first reached the stars. They had dreamed of exploration and discovery, of peaceful contact with alien civilizations and sharing of knowledge across species. Instead, they had become warriors whose reputation struck fear into the hearts of anyone who threatened the peace. But perhaps that was the greatest service they could provide. Perhaps being willing to fight was what allowed others to live without fighting. Perhaps accepting the burden of violence was what protected others from experiencing it. In the end, the battlefield had taught the galaxy an eternal truth. Civilization exists only because someone is willing to defend it. Light endures only because someone is willing to stand in the darkness. Peace continues only because someone is ready for war. And humanity, for better or worse, had become that someone. The stars belong to all species now, safe and secure under the protection of warriors who had proven they would sacrifice everything to keep them that way. It was a heavy responsibility, a terrible burden, and an honor that humanity would carry for as long as the galaxy needed them. The war was over. The peace had begun, and human soldiers stood ready to defend both. 5 years had passed since the last major battle of the Vorthak War. The galaxy had settled into an uneasy peace that everyone understood was maintained by the presence of human military forces scattered across dozens of sectors. Commander Jyla, now promoted to admiral, stood in the rebuilt capital of Kepler 442b and marveled at how much had changed. The city that had been reduced to rubble during the fighting now gleamed with new construction. Coalition engineers had worked alongside human builders to create something better than what had existed before. Parks honored the fallen soldiers of all species. Memorial walls carried the names of those who had died defending this world. Children from a dozen different species played in streets that had once run red with blood. But Jyla knew that beneath the surface of peace the galaxy remained fundamentally altered. The civilizations that had nearly been destroyed had not forgotten their vulnerability. They had not forgotten who had saved them when all seemed lost. She was here today to meet with Sergeant Bo, one of the human veterans who had fought in the initial defense of Kepler 442b. Bo had stayed on the planet after the war, unable or unwilling to return to Earth. He now ran a small business in the rebuilt city, training security personnel for coalition corporations. Admiral, Bo greeted her with a slight nod when she entered his training facility. His hair had gone gray at the temples and he moved with a slight limp from old injuries. But his eyes still held the sharp awareness of a combat veteran. "I heard you were coming. What brings a coalition flag officer to my little operation?" Jyla gestured to the recruits training in the facility behind them. They were young beings from various species, learning hand-to-hand combat techniques and tactical thinking from human instructors. "I wanted to see what you have built here, and to thank you if that is not too late." Bo smiled slightly. "Thank me? Admiral, I was just doing my job." "Your job was to delay the Vorthak advance," Jyla replied. "You and your soldiers saved 230 civilians who had no military value. You held positions that should have been abandoned. You fought when logic said you should retreat. That was more than just a job." Bo looked out at his students and was quiet for a moment. "Those civilians had value to us. Every life has value to humans, even when the math says otherwise. That is what makes us different, I think. We do not calculate whether saving someone is worth the cost. We just save them if we can." This fundamental difference in thinking had reshaped how the entire galaxy approached security and defense. Coalition military academies now included mandatory training with human instructors. They taught courses on aggressive tactics, emotional decision-making in combat, and how to fight when victory seemed impossible. These concepts had been foreign to galactic military doctrine before humans arrived. Now they were considered essential knowledge. Lieutenant Huon had become one of those instructors. The Rigelian who had first witnessed human combat effectiveness now spent his days teaching coalition officers how to think like humans when facing overwhelming odds. His students came from the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, yet they struggled with concepts that came naturally to humanity. "The problem is not that they lack courage," Huon explained to a visiting delegation of coalition officials. "The problem is that they have been taught to think of war as a logical exercise with calculable outcomes. Humans understand that war is chaos, and sometimes the only way to win is to embrace that chaos." He pulled up a tactical simulation on the classroom display. It showed a defensive position being overrun by superior enemy forces. "What would your species do in this situation?" he asked his students. The answers were predictable. Retreat to preserve forces, call for reinforcements, establish a fallback position. All logical, all reasonable, all correct by traditional military doctrine. "Now let me show you what humans did in this exact situation during the Battle of Ridge 7, Huon said, modifying the display. The human forces on the simulation did not retreat. Instead, they counterattacked directly into the enemy advance, creating chaos and confusion that disrupted the enemy's coordination. The position held long enough for reinforcements to arrive, but at the cost of 60% casualties for the defenders. "This makes no sense," said a Zentoran student. "The casualties are unacceptable." "The casualties were terrible," Hyun agreed. "But the alternative was losing the entire defensive line, which would have led to thousands and more deaths. Humans accepted the terrible choice because someone had to. That is the lesson you must learn." This lesson was being taught across the galaxy, but its implementation remained difficult for most species. They could understand human tactics intellectually, but applying them required a fundamental change in how they thought about sacrifice and duty. Private Na, who had made the desperate charge that helped turn the tide at Kepler 442b, had returned to Earth after the war. She tried to resume her civilian life working as an engineer in Seoul, but she found herself unable to connect with people who had not experienced what she had experienced. The concerns of daily life seemed trivial compared to the life and death decisions she had made on the battlefield. She eventually joined a support group for veterans, where she met others struggling with the same transition. They gathered weekly to talk about their experiences and help each other navigate a world that did not understand what they had been through. "Sometimes I wonder if it was worth it," Na said during one meeting. "We stopped the Vorthak and saved billions of lives. But I look at what it did to us, what it cost us, and I wonder if there was another way." An older veteran named Sik, who had fought in the final assault on Kithra, shook his head. There was no other way. The coalition had tried everything else. They had tried diplomacy, defense, retreat, negotiation. Nothing worked against an enemy that only understood force. "We did what had to be done." "But we are still paying the price," Na replied quietly. "How many of us wake up at night seeing the faces of the people we killed? How many of us cannot connect with our families anymore because we have changed too much? How many of us will carry these wounds for the rest of our lives?" The room fell silent because everyone there knew the answer. All of them. Every single veteran carried scars that would never heal. The physical wounds would fade with time and medical treatment. The psychological wounds would remain forever. Yet, despite the cost, humanity continued to serve as the galaxy's military guardians. When new threats emerged, human forces responded. When disasters struck, human volunteers deployed. When anyone in the coalition needed help, humanity answered the call. Captain Gill, who had captured the Vorthak war machines through impossible tactics, now commanded a rapid response fleet that patrolled the border regions. His ships were always ready to deploy at a moment's notice to any crisis in coalition space. His crews were volunteers who knew they would face danger regularly and might never receive recognition for their service. "Why do you keep doing this?" asked a Rigelian journalist who was documenting human military service for a galactic news network. "Your species has already given so much. You have already proven yourselves. Why continue to risk everything?" Gil thought carefully before answering. "Because if we stop, who will do it? The galaxy is safer now than it was 5 years ago, but that safety exists only because we maintain it. The moment we step back, the moment we decide that we have sacrificed enough, everything we fought for could unravel." This sense of ongoing responsibility had become deeply embedded in human culture. Children on Earth grew up learning about the Vorthak War and the soldiers who had saved the galaxy. Schools taught that with great capability came great responsibility. Military service was honored as one of the highest callings a person could pursue. But there were also voices of concern. Some human philosophers worried that their species was becoming too militarized, too focused on war and violence. They argued that humanity was losing the curiosity and wonder that had driven them to the stars in the first place. Ambassador Cho addressed these concerns in a speech at Earth's Global Assembly. "We have not become a warrior species," she said firmly. "We have become a species that maintains warriors because the galaxy needs them. But we are still explorers, still scientists, still artists and dreamers. We are still everything we were before the war. We have simply added the responsibility of protection to our other pursuits." She gestured to a display showing human achievements since the war, medical advances shared with coalition species, cultural exchanges that had enriched both human and alien societies, scientific discoveries made through cooperation between species, colonies established on new worlds where humans and aliens lived together in peace. "The galaxy knows us as warriors because that is when we are most visible," Cho continued. "But for every soldier standing watch, there are thousands of humans building, creating, learning, and growing. We have not abandoned who we are. We have simply accepted who we must be." In the ruins of the Vorthak Empire, a different transformation was taking place. The hive mind that had once threatened the entire galaxy had fragmented after its defeats. Individual Vorthak were learning to think for themselves, to make decisions independent of the collective. It was a painful and confusing process for a species that had never known individuality. A delegation of Vorthak diplomats came to Earth to negotiate a formal peace treaty. They were escorted by human security personnel, a detail that made many observers nervous. Could humans work peacefully with the enemy they had fought so fiercely? General Yu met with the Vorthak delegation personally. She looked at the beings who had killed so many of her soldiers, and felt a complex mixture of emotions: anger at what they had done, pity for what they had become, hope that peace might actually be possible. "We do not ask for forgiveness," said the lead Vorthak diplomat through a translation device. "We know that what our collective did was unforgivable. We seek only to ensure that it never happens again." Yu nodded slowly. "Forgiveness is not mine to give. That belongs to the families of those who died, to the civilizations you destroyed, to the billions who suffered. But I can offer you a chance to build something better, a chance to prove that you have truly changed." The peace treaty was signed in a ceremony attended by representatives from every coalition species. It included provisions for Vorthak rehabilitation, monitoring of their military capabilities, and gradual reintegration into galactic society. Many opposed the treaty, arguing that the Vorthak should be punished more severely. But humanity advocated for peace, understanding that endless punishment would only create new conflicts in the future. Sergeant Day, who had led some of the fiercest assaults during the war, attended the ceremony as part of the Human Honor Guard. He stood at attention while former enemies signed documents that would hopefully prevent future bloodshed. It felt strange to be here protecting Vorthak delegates after spending months trying to kill their warriors, but he understood the purpose. War had achieved what it could achieve. Now it was time for peace to do its work, and if that peace required humans to set aside their anger and work toward reconciliation, then that was another burden they would carry. As the ceremony concluded, Day looked around at the assembled species. Altarians and Rigelians, Zentaurans and Vorthak, dozens of civilizations that had been enemies or strangers just years ago. Now they were building something together, creating a galaxy where cooperation replaced conflict. Human sacrifice had made this possible. Human determination had created the conditions for peace. Human willingness to fight had given everyone the chance to stop fighting. The galaxy had changed, and humanity had changed with it. They were no longer the naive newcomers exploring the stars with wonder and hope. They were seasoned veterans who understood the darkness that lurked in the universe and were prepared to face it. But they had not lost their fundamental humanity in the process. They still dreamed of better futures. They still worked for peace. They still believed that civilizations could grow beyond violence. They simply understood now that believing in peace meant being prepared for war. That protecting innocence sometimes required doing terrible things. That the price of civilization was eternal vigilance and the willingness to pay whatever cost that vigilance demanded. Admiral Jayla returned to her ship after meeting with Sergeant Bo, carrying with her a deeper understanding of the species that had saved her world. Humans were not perfect. They were not invincible. They made mistakes and suffered losses like anyone else. But they possessed something that set them apart from every other species in the galaxy. They possessed the willingness to stand between evil and innocence, knowing they might be destroyed in the process, and choosing to stand anyway. That simple determination had saved the galaxy once, and everyone understood it would probably be called upon to save the galaxy again someday. When that day came, humanity would be ready. The soldiers would deploy, the battles would be fought, and the sacrifices would be made. Because that was who they had become. That was the role they had accepted. That was the burden they would carry for as long as the stars shined and beings needed protection. The echoes of war would never fully fade. They would resound through human culture for generations, shaping how they saw themselves and how others saw them. But those echoes also carried within them the sounds of hope, of courage, of the better future that human sacrifice had made possible. And in the end, perhaps that was enough.